Good morning, everyone. Just checking to make sure everyone can hear me loud and clear. This is Arnita. We'll be getting started in just a couple of minutes here. So thank you all for joining and stay tuned. Great. Thank you, Wanda. All right, so I have about 10 o'clock my time here in California, and hopefully it's 1 p.m. your time if you're on the East Coast, but we are all ready to get started. So thank you all for joining. This is the second session or a second edition in our Policy Skills Building webinar series from CW and USA. I am very excited today to be co-presenting with some really fabulous advocates here. We have Kirsty Fontaine of the Young Women of Color Leadership Council, who will be giving the presentation for us. Barb Cardell, who many of you know, who is our fabulous chair of our CW and USA Board of Directors, as well as her leadership in Positive Women's Network Colorado. And me, Arnita Rogers, I am the Reproductive Justice and HIV Fellow here at Positive Women's Network USA. So thank you all for joining. I see you all in the chat box. I believe Nana Khanna, our Executive Director, will also be joining us in the chat box to answer any questions that come up as we go through today's webinar. All right, so as I was saying, this is the second installment in our Policy Skills Building webinar, and I just want to recap for those that maybe were able to join the Policy 101 webinar, or maybe you're joining just the second one, but just as a review, what we covered in that Policy 101 webinar is that we started off by reviewing federal agencies and where federal policy is administered. We also reviewed the federal legislative policymaking process and any similarities that there were to the state legislative process, and kind of how the two processes, or the state legislative process, mirrors the federal legislative process. And we also learned how to identify key policymakers to target advocacy efforts and how. So if you're interested and you weren't able to catch that first webinar in the series, I highly recommend, if you didn't, being able to go back and catch it. We have it recorded on our website, and also the link is embedded right here on this slide if you're interested in getting that first kind of grounding bit of material on policy skills. So this next, our presentation today will build off of what we discussed in that Policy 101 that kind of detailed more of the process about federal policy and state policy making, and kind of talk about the analysis of doing policy and advocacy work. How do we do policy analysis? So today we'll start out kind of in the big picture realm, where we'll learn to use the social ecological model as a tool for policy analysis. And that part of the presentation, Kirsty will lead us in. Second, we'll look at HIV Criminalization campaign in Colorado and use that as a case study for doing policy analysis, which Barb Cardell will lead that discussion. And then last, I'll be guiding the discussion in some very nuts and bolts tools that you can use in trying to find more information about policies and how you can go about analyzing them. So without further ado, I will turn it over to our first fabulous presenter, Kirsty Fontaine. You can take it away, Kirsty.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Arnetta, and thank you everyone for joining. I'm really excited to be here with you today to talk a little bit about using the social ecological model as a tool for analyzing policy. Just a little bit about myself. Oh, no, let's first do a look ahead. We're going to look quickly at the introduction and looking at theory-based frameworks and how to use them in our advocacy work. I'll do a quick overview of the socio-ecological model and how it can be a tool in analyzing policy, and then we'll actually take that model and apply it and analyze certain aspects of policy, and then we'll move into a quick polling question to kind of figure out where we are in terms of what we learned. So a little bit about me. I am a member of the Young Women of Color Leadership Council, which is an organization through Advocates for Youth, and we advocate for the inclusion of women of color in reproductive health programming so that we can become empowered to advocate for ourselves. We do a lot of work on the ground. It's a 13-member council, and we are from high school age. Our youngest member is 14, and she's amazing, up to 24, 25, and we're just working in our local communities, holding webinars, engaging with local stakeholders, and figuring out, okay, so young women of color, we have issues. We have things that we need to talk about. We have things that we are going through, but we are the authority on that topic. We need to be part of that conversation. So I've really loved the work I've been able to do with YWalk, and I'm excited to talk to you all today about that. So jumping into the policy level, as we talked earlier, we're going to be looking at policies and how do we analyze them. Sometimes policies can kind of be this big, scary thing in the sky of like, how do I break this down? So a way we're able to do this is by using a framework. And this specific framework we're going to be using today is a theory-based framework. So a theory-based framework is a collection of interrelated concepts that guides the way you think and reason through relationships. So the main idea here is understanding a concept. A concept is a collection of vetted ideas, and they're typically supported by trends and a generalization. An example of that would be, depending on where you are, you can assume that in December and January, it's going to be cold. You're going to need to wear a scarf. You're going to need gloves and things of that nature. So taking on experiential trends, looking at how those apply in relationships. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we look closely into the social ecological model. I'm looking at this model. It's also called the socio-ecological model, depending on who you ask, but it was developed in the 1970s, and it was created to be able to better understand the complex, interrelated, and compounded effects of personal and environmental factors that determine behavior. As we all know, that working in our field, working in advocacy, it isn't completely just always black and white and cut and dry. There are many things that work together to have the health effects and that affect the behaviors that we're able to engage in. So this model is kind of a way of looking at, hey, this isn't a completely isolated issue. There are things that come together, and not only understanding how these factors influence behavior, but understanding how the factors relate to one another. The model provides a framework by which we're able to identify behavioral and organizational intervention points. The great thing about the social behavioral model is not only does it allow you to break down policy and figure out what's going on at each level, but by breaking it down by level, we're also able to understand where interventions can be most effective. So this is the model itself. It is a 5-level model, and we'll go through each level and see what questions and what things are kind of housed in that level. So looking at our figure, we see that the smallest level, the most micro level, is the individual, and this really looks at the knowledge, attitudes, and skills that we all have as individuals. What makes us unique? What guides our individual behavior? The second level is really interpersonal, looking at our interactions with one another, interactions with family and friends, and social networks. The organizational level, we're looking at the organizations and social institutions that influence our health and behavior. So we're looking at churches, we're looking at religious organizations, schools, other community groups, advocacy groups on the ground. How do they influence the interpersonal or individual level? Looking at community, it's a little bit above organizational and saying, okay, so we have these organizations on the ground. How do they work together? Are they collaborating? Are there partnerships? Are people working in silos? So that's really important to look at, okay, so if we're trying to implement this change, we have to attack it in a multifaceted way. And the community level is a great way to see that part of an intervention. And finally, where we're really going to spend some time today is that public policy level. So whether it's the national, state, or local laws that really influence everything below them in the model. So in terms of looking at HIV and reproductive justice, there are several ways we could go about this. We could look at gender inequity, we could look at stigma, we could look at violence against women and girls, we could look at economics. But today, because of my background, I chose to focus on sex education in the United States. So sex ed is going to be a really interesting example in that on the federal level, there's little in terms of specific outlines of saying you have to do this, you can't do this. At the federal level, it's really more about funding. The federal government provides funding pools for states and organizations to be able to draw from to implement sex education and pregnancy prevention programs. But in terms of mandating what's taught in schools, what's taught in organizations, the federal government doesn't really have much say there. As of 2016, 23 states and DC require public schools to teach sex ed, and 22 of those mandate sex ed and HIV education. It's already a red flag there in terms of looking at how they're separating sex ed and HIV education. It seems a little counterproductive when we realize that sex ed is needed to fully understand HIV education. We need to understand the context, though we know that there are ways to deal with HIV that are outside of a sexual manner, but really understanding that context and navigating that space is important. Only 11 states mandate only HIV education. Again, looking at why are we not teaching about sex? Why are we not teaching about things that really do end up relating back to HIV education? And finally, 7 states require that if provided, sex education must be medically, factually, and technically accurate. I don't think this bears much explanation, but this is really where we fall into that trap of misinformation and myths of students asking, can you get HIV from kissing? Should I not share a spoon or a fork with someone? And it just really perpetuates that stigma and fear, not really understanding the way the body, the way things really work. And it really is something that we need to address. We not only need to have sex education and HIV education together, we have to have it in a way that it's medically, factually, and technically accurate so that we can be disseminating the appropriate information. So why is sex education important when talking about HIV? At the basic level, HIV is really a key tool, education rather is really a key tool for HIV prevention. And when we look at the amount of students that would be impacted by publicly funded schools providing HIV and sex education, it really, at least to me, seems like somewhat of a no-brainer in that if we want to get the biggest bang for our buck, if we want to get that widespread impact, we do start at the school level. We do start at somewhere where we have these students 6 to 8 hours a day giving them this kind of information. Additionally, we've also found that there are gaps in terms of what youth think about sex, what they understand, what they know. A lot of them may not understand how condoms work. I've spoken with some students who don't necessarily understand the difference between hormonal methods and barrier methods of contraception. So when you're looking at, okay, so if I sleep with this person and use birth control, just the birth control pill, I won't get an STI, right? And realizing that's not the right way of thinking. You need a barrier method. Those are the types that keep you from spreading those types of infections. So having those difficult conversations, understanding that we need to spread this knowledge is key in not only sex education as a whole, but specifically looking at HIV. And additionally, not knowing that HIV is sexually transmitted infection. Again, this is, to a lot of us, just like 101, a basic level of understanding what goes on. So we're going to use this example and actually go back a little bit and look through the social ecological model and how different levels are affected. Looking at the individual level, we're saying, okay, so we don't have sex education and HIV education in school. How does that impact? So we're thinking about the knowledge and attitudes and skills that we just talked about. Do we understand how HIV is transmitted? Do we understand how to use condoms? Do we understand contraception? Those are some things that really influence how an individual interacts in their behavior around sexuality. At the interpersonal level, we have the family, friends, and social networks. Are they being supportive? Are they being supportive in terms of advocating for women and girls to be able to make healthy sexual choices? And this is kind of where stigma and cultural norms come in. Do we live in a culture? Are you in an environment where you, being a woman with agency and advocacy over your body, is able to make decisions about your sexuality? Looking at the organizational level, we talked a little bit about schools, but how schools are not necessarily always the best place to get this kind of information. So what's being done on the ground? Do we have nonprofit organizations? Do we have advocacy organizations? Do we have religious organizations that are picking up that slack? And moving up to the community level, are these organizations working together? Like we mentioned before, working in silos only allows you to do a one-to-one in terms of leveraging your own resources, but working in partnerships, collaborations really is a way to leverage everyone's resources and increase your impact. And finally, looking at the public policy level, what laws are we going to have put in place? Yes, we have some things mandated on the state level, but bringing it down to the local level, are these things being implemented? Are they being implemented consistently? Are we actually keeping people accountable in terms of what they are teaching in schools? So using this model, we can kind of break down the lack of policy around education, sex education, and see where the gaps are. A great thing about this model is that not only are you able to kind of go through policy, you're able to figure out intervention points. So looking at the individual level, so you could frame education interventions. Do we need to do on-the-ground advocacy? Do we need to have face-to-face interactions with people talking about HIV education, talking about sex? In terms of interpersonal, we have to recognize the culture that we've formed and try to change the narrative around sex, around HIV. We need to combat stigma. Organizational, do we need to get on the school board? Do we need to talk to some of these organizations and figure out, okay, so you've been silent on this. How do we actually make this a thing? How do we bring this to the forefront? And in terms of working organizations, bringing that community level in, so are we going to put together a partnership? How are we going to work collaboratively to impact this issue? And finally, at the policy level, looking at lobbying, writing policy briefs, and really engaging with lawmakers around this issue. So the main takeaway from this model is really that there is no right way to impact policy to advocate. It really just comes down to your level and your needs in terms of what are your stakeholders, what is your audience, and what do you want to do in terms of your impact. So this model is just really a tool by which we can analyze what's going on, and by analyzing what's going on, we can kind of pick and choose what areas we feel are feasible for our purposes and engage in it that way. And I use this model just on sex education, but we can use this in terms of anything. I focus on prevention, but we could really use this in terms of analyzing laws for people living with HIV, which Barb will do in a little bit. So at each level, are there barriers or hindrances that keep people from HIV from accessing the services and resources that they need? So this model is really a helpful tool in terms of orienting yourself, in terms of where in the policy process you want to be the most engaged. And so with that, I just want to conclude with a few points. I know there was a lot going on, but I just want to make these three main points that the model really is to provide a framework by which we're able to analyze policy and its effects. Being able to look at each level, a lot of policies have impacts at each level or several levels of the model. So it could have one or several. So being able to sit down with that piece of legislation and understanding where the impacts are. We're also able to use the model to analyze the landscape where there are not policies in place. So with the example that we just used, we said there are no real policies at the federal level. So conversely, you can use the model to see what the gaps are. If there is no policy in place, what is your current environment? What's going on right now? And finally, it allows us to develop interventions by defining our target level and helping us understand that influence can happen at any one or at multiple levels. So there isn't a right way. You don't have to jump to the policy level right away. For your purposes, it might make more sense, hey, I might need to target an organization. I might need to start with interpersonal. So really using this model, however it benefits you, to understand where your impact is. And with that, we will jump into our polling question. I'll pass it on to you, Arnetta. And our question here is, based on what we've talked about, what is the most macro, so the highest level of the social ecological model? So I think there's a way for you all to, awesome, there it is. And you all can go ahead and key in your answers. Awesome. I think we have everyone, and I think a couple more people can answer. But yes, for those of you who did answer public policy, that is the highest level of the model. If we go back a couple slides, we can see here that that is the most encompassing level of the model. Not that any of the others are less important, but in terms of the one that has the potential to have the most macro level and highest change, it's going to be public policy. So with that, I thank you all so much. I can be reached at the email address above, and if you want to learn a little bit more about the Women of Color Leadership Council, you can visit our Facebook page. And we have a social media campaign called Shades of Rosie, which is really us interviewing women of color and getting their stories and their lives. So you have access to our Tumblr page there as well. So I thank you all so much. I look forward to your questions, and I will pass it off.
Okay, thank you so much, Kirsty. That was a really excellent overview of the social ecological model as a tool that we can use in analyzing policy. Next up, we'll have Barb Cardell that will be talking about, she'll be talking about a bill that she's working on in Colorado around HIV criminalization as a case study for doing policy analysis. So take it away, Barb.
Sure. Thanks, Arnetta, and welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today on the policy webinar. I think that, we oftentimes think that policy is something that we're not capable of understanding or impacting. And so I keep this slide actually to remind myself that before I start to analyze policy or meet with a policymaker, to just take a deep breath and remind myself that I can do this, and that anyone who feels strongly about a policy or about rights can understand and can impact policy. We are subject matters in our own lives, and that as women living with HIV, we need to know that we bring unique perspectives that are often missing from conversations. And so as we have started talking about, we are persistent advocates, and we demand that women living with HIV are at the table. Are you guys there? That sounds like people might not be able to hear me. Oh, yes, people can hear. Okay, yes. So, as Wanda said, we are persistent advocates when we talk about the rights and needs of women living with HIV, and that impacts so much of what we do. Today, excuse me, today we're going to talk about HIV criminalization reform in Colorado, and I think it is important to start off by saying when we look at public policy, we can analyze it, and that can be quite quick. But when we seek to impact reform and institute change, it is a long process. And we don't have to do it all ourselves, but when we have partners, it certainly lightens the load and helps us go further. So in 2011 in Colorado, we started having a conversation about HIV criminalization, primarily on a national level. We had recognized that it was mentioned in the National HIV/AIDS Strategy and that this was something that globally and nationally had great importance. And in 2012, we met for the first time with PW in Colorado and other people living with HIV organizations and started to analyze the laws that we had in our state and to gather background on how they were impacting people living with HIV and people at risk of acquiring HIV. And we found to our horror, and I think that that's not an understated word, we were horrified to learn what we had in Colorado. That were some pretty specific and pretty ugly criminal statutes that were being applied. So we looked around to see if anybody else has this problem, and that was 2013. And we gathered information. And in 2014, we went to the HIV is Not a Crime. We had 5 women from PW in Colorado who attended, and we started to realize that if Iowa could impact change, that Colorado certainly should as well. And so in 2015, we had to rethink our plan. We did not have a bill drafted, which we had hoped. But in 2016, which is now, we have a bill that is up in front of the Colorado Senate. It was voted out of committee yesterday and is supposed to go for a vote on the Senate floor on Thursday or Friday of this week. So that's the process. And now I'll take a step back and I will say, so what did our laws look like? We started off by just doing Google searches for the Colorado Revised Statutes, and that is something that you can find on LexisNexis. And we realized that when we did searches for HIV, we found HIV mentioned specifically in 2 places. The first was that there were 3 laws that specifically targeted people living with HIV based on knowledge of their status. And these are laws that oftentimes people think are fine to actually target for any sort of sentence enhancements because they are laws that impact other people. And what we've realized is that these laws are used to threaten people who are living with HIV to plead guilty. And so it became a due process question. And I want to take a step back and say that any laws that specifically target anyone based on a identity or a disease, in my mind, are reprehensible. And so we looked at our penetrative sexual assault charge, which had a mandatory sentencing of 3 times the maximum. And we realized that this had never been charged, but that it had been threatened several times to our knowledge. So we gathered community information to understand how it was being used. When we started looking at the prostitution with knowledge of HIV criminal statute, we realized that this was the most problematic of all the laws that we had on the books. We gathered collectively from agencies that were working with women living with HIV, with youth, with homeless people, that this was the law that was most often being used to get people to plead guilty to a lesser charge. Because if you were charged with prostitution with knowledge of HIV, it instantly became a felony as opposed to a misdemeanor charge. At that point in time, we really decided that we needed to do something serious about getting these laws removed. And when I talk about our 2013 plan where we were trying to just remove these criminal statutes, every time we would go and talk to a elected official about this, they would cringe because we would be talking about removing a criminal code, and the DAs and the police all like to have those there to use. And we were talking about HIV, which we realized we needed to do a lot of education for our elected officials, that we needed to talk about stigma, that we needed to talk about medically accurate information, and we needed to talk about science. So we took a step back in 2013 and did some education. It's never enough, but we certainly managed to get people at least being able to talk to us about it. So when we realized we weren't going to be able to just impact these criminal codes, we decided to take a larger step and to go back and look at our HIV and STI laws, which are in the public health statutes, and that was the second place we were able to find our HIV-specific mentions, and that these were laws that were old as well, that they had been drafted in the late 80s, early 90s, and that they were intending to have a public health aspect, but that it was, again, stigmatizing language, that it was not science-based, that it was not medically accurate. And so instead, we took a broader approach, and we decided to modernize all of our STI language to include HIV under STIs, and to then go ahead and ask for a repeal of our particular criminal codes under that broader modernization language. And that approach proved to be, interestingly, much more successful. We were able to get a sponsor. Senator Pat Stedman has agreed to introduce the bill for us, and is, as I mentioned before, currently doing pretty well. So who is impacted currently by our laws? I mentioned it briefly as I was talking. And I love this picture. Wahida and I in front of the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. So when we look at who is impacted by Colorado's laws, in particular the prostitution laws, we discovered that it had been applied in 30 cases in the last 10 years, and that disproportionately 80% of those cases were women, and that a majority of them were youth or homeless or of trans experience. And so we started talking about our laws having a social justice lens as well. And that was very interesting, because up until then, we had been advocates who were working to impact change. And once we started talking about social justice, then all of a sudden we had a lot of other partners who were interested in working with us in moving this law forward, which I thought was fascinating and very useful. And we really talk about the impact of HIV criminalization in Colorado. We talk about it leading to fear of testing for HIV. If you can be prosecuted under these codes because of knowledge of HIV, why would anybody ever want to know their status? If it was about knowledge of HIV, we also would worry that people would not be accessing services. As we talked about the STI and HIV language that was older, that we really needed to talk about stigma. We needed to talk about misinformation about transmission and populations. We needed to really continue to mention that HIV being called out in criminal statutes treated people living with HIV as a viral underclass who were 3 times as bad as anybody else who had done any of these crimes. And that we needed to talk about incarceration instead of parole. If you're sentenced to a felony or to the sentence enhancement, you are not eligible for an early parole or probation. And so it took some of the other deferment options off the table, which to us was unacceptable. And as we know that when people are criminalized and institutionalized, they lose a lot of economic opportunity that their family suffers and their community suffers, and that was unacceptable to us. So that's a broad sense of where we're at, and I want to talk about how we analyzed it and how we ended up coming up with where we're at. And I apologize, as I look at this slide, it's a little busy, but I want to talk about these things in particular. So we started off by analyzing the current existing laws and statutes. We then sat down with a group of us, about 20 people living with HIV in our community, many of them women, and talked about the impact that these laws had in our lives. We collected examples of how it had been instituted and how we saw it playing out in Colorado. And then we talked in a big picture perspective about what we wanted to do about that. And we realized that these were unacceptable and that we were going to, first off, try and repeal the criminal codes, but finally to just modernize everything. Then we started looking at the language, and we drafted language that was several times, several permutations actually, where we tried to just change language, and then we realized that we needed to redraft the entire bill. And I will take a moment here and stop and say that drafting a bill sounds really intimidating, but what it is it's looking at language, and where something is inappropriate, you just write it in the way you think that it should be. And it is a pretty exciting reality to see a lot of the language around compassion, around fighting stigma, around ensuring that people know their status and are able to seek medical care in a compassionate way is actually part of our bill. So that is pretty exciting. And then what you do is when you have a draft of what you feel you would like to do, we went and looked for our sponsor. And as I said, Senator Pat Stedman was willing to introduce the bill and modified it actually not a lot, which was empowering also. Then what you need to do is you need to kind of keep an eye on through the General Assembly how things are being introduced. We had a bill that was introduced in the House that was in opposition to our bill, and that was 1393, and it was mandating that people living with HIV, if they were charged of an assault, could be mandatorily tested for any communicable disease. So we had to go and testify against that, and that's the middle blurb, which is a testimony we did last week where Carrie Hartel went and talked about it from a perspective of stigma and judgment, and we managed to shut that down. And so as you all can tell, this is a really quick overview of the process, but I go back to my original slide, which is that we can all do this. We all have the power, we all have the wisdom, and we are all persistent advocates to affect change in our lives. And again, Margaret Mead, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. And PWN USA and PWN's regional groups form that basis for us to come together and be those committed citizens and be the voice for women living with HIV. So I will now go to the polling question. So polling question number 2. Have you ever reviewed or analyzed state law? And the options are yes, HIV-specific laws, yes, other policy, no, I'm not interested in reviewing and analyzing state laws, and no, I don't know how to begin. I'll just give another second or two if anybody else would like to go ahead and vote. And so it looks like many people have reviewed and analyzed state laws specific to HIV, and that some have looked at other policy, and there are a couple who don't know how to begin. And I would say that being on this webinar and being part of PWN USA is a great place to start because you have the opportunity to join other campaigns in action and also to make connections with some of the PWN sisters who would love to help you in that process. So thank you very much for having me on the webinar, and Arnita, I will turn it back over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Barb, and thank you for all the work that you're doing in leading the way in HIV criminalization work in Colorado. That was a really great overview. Okay, so in this final section, I'm going to be talking about some of the nuts and bolts of doing policy work. How do you find the statutes that are harmful or that you want to change, like the HIV criminalization statute in Colorado that Barb was speaking, in order to do that kind of analysis, that big picture analysis that Kirsty was talking about in her presentation. So this last section will focus on that. So if you want to do policy analysis, it's important to figure out what type of policy you are trying to analyze. If you remember in Policy 101, we talked about the federal policymaking process and how the state policymaking process kind of mirrored that, but it's also important to note that there's different types of policies at each level. So there are federal laws that probably govern the laws throughout the entire country, and each state is require to follow these laws. And some examples of federal laws that we all subscribe to or might impact us all might be our laws on Social Security, any federal anti-discrimination civil rights laws, and immigration law is also something that impacts us at the federal level. Now, as far as state laws, that is where we find our criminal statutes and our criminal laws. So as we talk about doing HIV criminalization work or changing those laws, that is going to be on a state-by-state basis. Now, the federal government has issued guidelines, they've suggested ways that states might comply with what they feel is the vision for HIV criminalization, but it's up to each state around changing the laws and their criminal statutes as they relate to HIV. Other examples of state laws are, family laws as they deal with marriage or divorce or custody matters, and also, wills and inheritances and estates. You'll find those under your state laws. And then at the very local level, you have your local laws, and many times they're called ordinances. You might have heard of a city ordinance. So that might have, those laws might include rent laws. Here in the Bay Area, we have a rent control law that control the amount that a landlord can raise your rent, and zoning laws, where different types of businesses can build, or commercial versus residential zoning. So that all happens at the local level. So it's important to know before you jump into your analysis, where are you going to be looking, at the local, state, or the federal level? Also, I want to tag that in our last webinar, we talked about the legislative making process, but since we are in an election year, many folks may have been, in many states where we have members, you might also have a process of direct democracy in which you might be able to vote on a state ballot initiative. So there's only about half the states in the country have this process of being able to vote on a state ballot initiative. And so that process, you might have been approached by someone gathering signatures to get a certain piece of legislation on a ballot that you will vote on. So they'll be signed by a certain minimum number of registered voters, and they can bring about a proposed vote on either a proposed statute or a constitutional amendment, and that's a state constitutional amendment, changing the state constitution. You might also have heard of them as being a popular initiative or a voter initiative or a voter proposition. I think you heard of like Prop 8 or Prop 35. Those are some pretty famous California propositions, things like that. Okay, so then to jump back, if you're interested in working on or analyzing federal policy, a good place to start and to find information about a specific bill would be to look at the Congressional website called congress.gov. And I took a screenshot here, and you might have to zoom in to see the details, but I want to be able to provide you with the website and show you some of the features on the website that could help you get into the policy analysis here. So I started off my search and taking it back to Kirsty's focus on comprehensive sex education. I put in a search for the Real Education, Health, and Youth Act. So I went to Congress.gov and typed it in the search box here, and that can give you information about the type of bill that bill was, whether it was started in the House or the Senate. If it was started in the House, it will begin with an H. If it was started in the Senate, it will begin with an S. And I encourage everyone to go back and review some of the graphics that we provided in the Policy 101 to show how the House of Origin may dictate the policy making process. On this website, you'll also be able to see on the left side that you can search what kind of subject, what kind of policy area that the bill you're working on might fall under. So this will be in the health, since we're talking about sexual health and sexual health education. You can also find the Chamber of Origin, which also dictates the bill type. And then each bill as it's going through the legislative process, will be heard in a particular policy committee. So this bill will be heard in the Health Committee, which is an acronym for the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee in Congress, Senate. It's nice because you can also see who is supporting this legislation and who are the co-sponsors. So this is a good place to know if you want to encourage your own legislator to sign on as a co-sponsor or thank them for sponsoring an important piece of legislation. You can find that information here on the left side in this drop-down menu to see if they've actually signed on as a co-sponsor. And then, of course, the party. It will show whether the co-sponsors are from the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. So this is at the federal level, and if you're looking at doing policy work or doing policy analysis at the federal level, this is a really great place to start. All right. So tracking state legislation or so that you can do policy analysis is a little bit different because each state has their own process that generally mirrors the federal policymaking process, but there's no main hub for the state. Each state has its own. So as I'm here in California, this is a snapshot of our legislative site here. And here it's really nice in California. You can search a bill at the top of the screen in the right-hand corner. You can search by bill number. And you can also do an informal search where you know keywords surrounding the bill language. You can look that way. But it's also nice if you see in the middle of the page, you can find information about the type of votes that have gone on around the bill, if it's been called to a vote, any history around the vote as it works through committees in different votes that have been called, and the bill analysis. So the bill analysis is important because as many of you have probably signed on to letters of support or opposition of a bill, that is all included in the bill analysis. And when committees, public policy committees are hearing and deciding to vote on a particular piece of legislation, they include those letters of support in analyzing the bill from their perspective. So this is a really important piece. Here you can see who else signed onto a piece of legislation, and that will all be included here, at least in California's website. You can see any changes to the bill language, and if it's been amended. You can compare different versions of the bill, and you can also, California has a portal in which you can submit comments directly to the author of the bill. The author is, of course, a legislator who is taking on the bill. So since each state is different, I want to be able to show that there is a variety of ways that different states might have their legislative records or make that available to the public. And so I chose North Carolina as an important example as we look at HB2, which is the very harmful policy. It's called, the formal title of it is called the Public Facilities Privacy and Security Act. North Carolina introduced out of that state legislator, but it's been dubbed in the media and by others as the bathroom bill. And we know that this has been a really harmful policy that has criminalized bathroom use for people of trans experience and making them use bathrooms of their sex assigned at birth. So it also preempts some local policies that have specific anti-discrimination policies protecting other members of the LGBTQ community. So I chose this as an example so that people, if you're interested in tracking that piece of legislation, you can go. This is on the North Carolina legislator website. You can look at the last actions of the bill. You can look at directly who sponsored, just like you could at the federal level, to see if you wanted to reach out to your own representative at the state level and, tell them that you are disappointed in their decision to sponsor such harmful policy, or encourage them, if they did not sponsor, to, really lobby other legislators to, take a second look at something like this. You can also see which statutes are implicated. Sometimes different pieces of policy might come from different parts of different statutes, like the Health and Safety Code or the Penal Code. So you can see which statutes are implicated here, and also what keywords you can search for. All right, and then I have the pleasure of taking a trip to visit with our PWN chapter in Philadelphia, and so I chose City Council of Philadelphia website to show that you can also track laws locally. And so many local laws are generally called city ordinances, but they will vary also by different city or municipality where you live. And generally, there will be a place or on a website for your city or county where you can find legislation that's been introduced either by your city council, or some cities call them board of supervisors, whatever your governing body of your city is. And so it's great because you can find here on the city council website for Philadelphia, you can find who your council member is. They have a tab for that. You can also find out what type of piece of policy has been passed. So here on the actual screen, it says that these resolutions have been either introduced or passed. There was one honoring members of the nonprofit leadership during Women's History Month last month, and that was a resolution, which is not a piece of policy, but it's more of a statement that a local governing body can make, saying that they recognize something or support for something. So that's one piece of legislation. And also the status of it, where it is has it been adopted, meaning that it's been passed, or is it in committee? So just like the federal and the state level making policy processes, local governments also have committees, generally policy committees, where pieces of legislation will be heard before they're voted on. Okay, so finally, in doing policy analysis, I know many folks have probably heard of or used fact sheets before, and I want to encourage you to continue using them as a resource. So for PWN, we have 6 policy priorities that we work under, and on our website, we have links to 6 different fact sheets that talk about those 6 policy priority areas. However, fact sheets can also be used to explain or garner support for a particular piece of legislation. So they can be used to educate legislators or the public. And it's important to think about who they come from. So I included a little snapshot of a fact sheet from a bill that we are supporting. We are co-sponsors here at PWN USA around HIV organ and tissue donation equity, which would allow a person living with HIV to do a donation to another person living with HIV. And so here I have, it's in colored boxes, but just an overview. You can look at the purpose, which will show you what the bill will do, your change in policy, what is it trying to do, the background, which will generally show you why the policy change is needed now, or why it's this time, if it's been this way for a certain number of years, why is this particular policy change needed now? And then support, you can see what other organizations have signed on to support this bill. Are they aligned with your core values as an individual or an organization that you're working for? It's a good way to analyze a particular policy. Here you see PWN, it has signed on along with Sex Workers Outreach Project, the Transgender Law Center, and other allies, ACLU of California. So those are generally allies that we do our work with. And then a summary, which generally will show the purpose, plus the background and any key provisions of the bill that you want to stick with the public. So I would encourage everyone to use fact sheets also as a resource as you are engaging in policy analysis or want to get a quick snapshot of the bill. So you have the tools of going directly to the source and looking at the statute and the language of legislation. finding out who is supporting it by looking at a fact sheet, and also getting a quick overview of the actual bill. Okay, so that brings us to our final polling question, and that is, where should you go to find out where state law is in the legislative process? Okay, polls are open now. I'll give you just a few moments to answer this final question. Okay. All right, and so most folks answered correctly in that you would go to your state website, which will vary by each state. I would encourage you all to do a quick Google search just to see what kind of resources your state does have available if you want to track a bill, find out what the statute actually says, to find out who supports the bill. Those are actually really good tools to start off doing policy analysis. Okay. So that brings us to our conclusion of our presentation, and I want to go ahead and open it up for questions on any of the pieces of the presentation that you heard today from myself, Barb, or Kirsty that you wanted to ask. So I'll go ahead and take the phones off mute now.
All attendees are muted and may unmute themselves by pressing *6.
Okay, so if you'd like to ask a question, you can press *6. We have just a few minutes. And also, if Kirsty and Barb, if there were anything that you wanted to add, please feel free to chime in now. *6 to unmute your line.
Hi, this is Wanda Brindle Monson, Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Wanda. Thank you.
I just wanted to give a shout out and a great thank you for, unfortunately, my state having to be lifted up as an example of insanity right now. But it is, what's going on here can be a good learning tool to be utilized in any state. Everything is really out and open and easy to find. If you Google any of it, you can follow and track back. But the point that you made about really reading a bill, because they're calling HB2 the bathroom bill, and there is far, far, far more bad stuff in it than just about bathrooms. So I just want to say thank you.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, Wanda. Yeah, there is definitely much more harmful policy provisions in that bill. That has been the part of the bill that's been really kind of upheld in the media, but there are definitely some other really harmful provisions in that bill.
Yes, there are.
Right. Were there any other questions or comments for the presenters? We have just a couple of minutes. All right. Well, without hearing any others, I will go through the chat box to make sure there weren't any others as well that we missed. But just wanted to thank you all for joining us today. This is our contact information for all three presenters again. And I also want to invite you all to participate in what will be the last installment in this series, that will also be, it's a co-facilitation of the other policy or the other skills building webinar series that have been going on through the communications department and the regional organizing department on values-based messaging for advocacy. And so that's going to be on Wednesday, May 25th. And the time is still TBD, but stay tuned for details through the different listservs, the work groups. That information will definitely be available very soon. This presentation, as all others, will be available on the CWN website as soon as possible, along with slides, so you can use them in your chapters and come back and to refer to any content that you wanted to review today. I'll turn it over to my other co-presenters to see if they have any final comments to check out. Otherwise, thank you all for coming.
Thank you all.
Yes, thank you so much.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you, everybody.
Hopefully see some of you in a couple of weeks.
Yes, we will. All right. Take care, everyone. Thank you so much.
Bye, guys.
Bye. Bye. Thank you.